Victory of Bombardier, the aircraft maker, is very good news for Northern Ireland. And in Davos, Donald Trump was doing his best, I said his best, to be conciliatory, to make nice. But for the Prime Minister, it's been another tough week. To be a successful leader, you need your own team to be united and properly behind you. Yet again, the Tory party has been elbowing, jostling, bickering and backstabbing. Was this the week, perhaps, when it became literally impossible for Theresa May to succeed? David Lidington, now effectively Mrs May's number 2, is here to respond. Does he, like the Chancellor, want very modest trade changes after Brexit? And the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn's here in the latest of our 2018 leader interviews. Does he, like his shadow Chancellor, think capitalism must change or face a social avalanche? Now then, it's hard to speak to camera through gritted teeth, but I'm doing my best. Bizarrely, President Trump hasn't given this show his first overseas interview. I can't think why. It's gone to Piers Morgan, his old mucker and an ITV presenter. So what have we learned? Piers joins me this morning. And in a busy week for politics, my news reviewers are the Observer's Sonia Sodha, Sam Coates of The Times, and the pro-Brexit commentator Isabel Oakeshott. All quite tense, a lot of that, and so to relax us back into our Sunday morning, the Royal Opera House star, Joseph Calleja. All of that after the news, read this morning by Ben Thompson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. Police are trying to establish how many people were in a car that crashed into a group of teenagers in Hayes in West London on Friday night, killing 3 teenage boys. They say at least 2 men were travelling in the car. One has been arrested, the other fled the scene. The 3 victims have been named locally as Josh Kennedy, Harry Rice and George Wilkinson. It's understood they'd been on their way to a birthday party at a football club when they were killed. Paris remains on high alert, with the River Seine expected to rise to 6 metres above its normal level later. It follows some of France's heaviest rain for a century. Sections of the Louvre Museum have closed, some properties have flooded, and tourist boats are no longer operating. A close friend and political ally of President Trump has resigned as head of fundraising for the Republican Party after accusations that he sexually harassed women who worked for him. Steve Wynn, a billionaire casino owner, was chosen by Mr. Trump to be finance chairman of the Republican National Committee. Mr. Wynn has described the claims, published by the Wall Street Journal, as preposterous. The former Northern Ireland Secretary and prominent Leave campaigner Theresa Villiers has said she fears the UK is heading towards a dilution of Brexit. Writing today in the Sunday Telegraph, she says there's a real danger the UK will sign up to a deal which would keep us in the EU in all but name. Downing Street said the government is committed to delivering a deep and special partnership with the European Union. And 16 and 17-year-olds in Wales are to be given the right to vote in local elections under plans published by the Welsh Government. If approved, Wales would follow Scotland, where the voting age has already been lowered for national and local elections. The Labour Party has called for the idea to be extended to the whole of the UK, but the Westminster government says it has no plans to do so. That's all from me. The next news on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Andrew, back to you.
Very many thanks for that, and so to the papers as ever. Tories in turmoil, says the Sunday Times. 2 different stories there brought under that headline. One of them about Gavin Williamson, the Defence Secretary, who appears on a lot of front pages, and he's probably a very fine fellow, but in my view, he has a terrifying smile. Now, the Sunday Telegraph, there he is again, not smiling this time. Williamson, we'll talk about that story in great detail. Mandarins forcing May into Brexit betrayal is their main story, and that, to be clear, is not about either oranges or Chinese officials, but number 10 apparatchiks. We'll talk again more about that. And then I was mentioning Piers Morgan and his great Trump interview, Trump's snub to PM over Brexit. That is the substantive story this morning from that interview, and you'll see a clip of that later on, and I will talk to Piers about it as well. And finally, there's the Observer in its new truncated form. Their main story is that the top academy schools sound alarm as cash crisis goes. And when you talk to people around the country, more and more people are saying, actually, school budgets, that's the real story that people like me on the TV are not talking enough about. So much to talk about. Where are we going to start? Let's start with that story, Isabel. Tories in turmoil.
And I know what you mean about Gavin Williamson's smile. In fact, I remember seeing Gavin Williamson after Theresa May's awful, disastrous speech at the Tory party conference, when you would have thought that Gavin Williamson, then the chief whip, would be looking ashen-faced. And he was actually grinning, and I thought I was very bemused by this. But today I suspect he'll be smiling a lot less, because he is all over the Sunday papers for the wrong reasons. A man who has been relishing manipulating the media to his own advantage in actually a way that I've found quite astonishing to watch, and has been very impressive in the way that he's been getting his case out for more money for the armed forces.
Basically, he's lobbying for cash.
He is indeed, and it's, you know, a lot of people within the Tory party are very pleased about that. You know, they feel this has been a long time coming. But now he has misstepped, I think. There's been a serious error of judgment here, and he is all over the papers over this long time ago, this apparent office romance that he had, and all the questions that he has opened up about whether he's told the full version of events.
Now, he denies lobbying and stuff. I suppose there is a real problem, Sam. If you're a cabinet minister and you have a passionate cause you believe in, whether you're Boris Johnson on the NHS or you're Gavin Williamson really thinking our armed services are underfunded, and you go out there and try and campaign publicly, we all say, aha, he's manoeuvring for the leadership. So you're damned if you do, damned if you don't.
And I think in this case, there is just the odd sign and the odd conversation and the odd person in Westminster who seems to indicate that in the case of Gavin Williamson, that's probably true, that in the event of a future vacancy, he might well go for it. And when that happens...
How did he get into this elevated position? Who suggested Gavin Williamson as the new Defence Secretary? Can you remember?
When you look around our cabinet of titans, it is hard to work out quite who might succeed Theresa May. And I think quite a lot of people around that table harbour private ambition. And when you harbour ambition, that brings with it enemies. And the variety of the stories on the front pages suggest that Gavin Williamson does have a number of people who are gunning for him, and that's going to be tricky. Now, the moment that your ambition goes up, so does the media intensity, and I suspect if he is serious about any kind of campaign bid, this is just the start of what going for the leadership feels like.
And it hasn't gone very well to start with. Sonia, nonetheless, he had that absolutely terrifying story, as terrifying as his smile, about the Russians going to kill thousands and thousands and thousands of us by targeting electrical stations and power stations and so forth. The Russians then mocked that as a kind of Monty Python story. What's your view of the reality there?
Well, you've got security officials, unnamed sources in some of the Sunday papers today coming out and saying, actually, he was disclosing intelligence here that shouldn't really be on the front pages. And I think there's some feeling in the Conservative Party that, in going for that very prominent splash, saying this about Russia, Williamson was just trying to distract from allegations that papers were making. And I don't think that that's a very good look. I think, when it comes to sort of the substance of the allegations, I think, he's now put himself in a position where he gave that interview to the Daily Mail this week. I think if that account stands, and it's found that that account stands, I think it's fine. I think this will go away. But I think if he's found to have lied about anything, there are sort of allusions in some of the Sunday papers this weekend that perhaps there was a harassment, a disciplinary harassment case involved.
We don't know this stuff, so we'll have to be very careful.
We don't know it. Yeah.
Nonetheless, and it's also probably objectively true that the Russians have leapt ahead in terms of their military technology, and we are falling back. So that is true as well.
It's probably just worth pointing out, if you look at this allegation that he may or may not have relied on intelligence when giving this Telegraph interview, who is doing the accusing? Well, there are a lot of anonymous quotes in the Sunday Times piece, but it says that the Foreign Office made a complaint. Who runs the Foreign Office? Boris Johnson.
Oh, so it does. There you go. It's really, really intriguing and skullduggery all over the place. And it's all, of course, deeply connected to the Brexit story, which I think you're going to pick up now, Sam, from the Sunday Telegraph.
Absolutely. Look, it feels this week as if the foundations of Westminster are once again shaking a bit as people try to work out, as you were saying in the introduction, how long Theresa May has got, given the apparent state of her political authority. And that's the reason for that is three problems. You've got her indecision, it would appear. You've got the lack of vision that MPs complain about. And then you've got Brexit. And it does feel that over the next 6 weeks, you've got crunch time over Brexit decision-making. Now, what you're going to get in the next few days is the Cabinet trying to bring together a discussion about where to go. And I think that's going to be accompanied by quite a lot of information and analysis from the civil service, pointing out some of the dangers of where some of the options go. People like Jeremy Hayward, Ollie Robbins, putting together these packs for Cabinet ministers.
Which is the Telegraph splash, basically.
And in the Telegraph, what you've got is unnamed Cabinet ministers going, hang on a moment, this could look quite gloomy, because these
people are Remainers, basically.
Because these people, these civil servants, aren't non-political actors. They're trying to influence the debate. They're trying to, as it were, push the Cabinet down a particular path. Whether that's fair or not, I'm not sure, but they're going, we don't like what they're saying.
Let's try and unpack a little bit of this more. This particular sort of frenzy started with the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, suggesting that after Brexit there'd be very, very little change in our trade relationships with the rest of the EU. Was that a misstep by him?
Precisely what the Prime Minister does not need right now at this incredibly sensitive moment for the Brexit negotiations and for her own leadership is her Chancellor suggesting that actually what we're going to get is this new thing called BRINO, Brexit in name only.
Of course, he would say he wasn't talking about the deal we'd strike, but he wants a really, really relatively unchanged trading relationship afterwards. Now, the question about that then is, if you're going to get that, what do you have to give the Europeans to achieve it?
Well, I'm afraid that his way of trying to spin himself out of that hasn't worked at all with either MPs who support Brexit or, I suspect, the 17.4 million people who voted for it. And when you see in the papers, as we have done in the last 48 hours, this suggestion that actually the transition period might be extended for another year, that merely plays into people's deep-seated suspicions
that it ain't gonna
that
happen.
It's not going to happen.
It ain't going to happen, OK. Can I move on? I think that's enough Brexit just for the time being. We'll talk about Brexit a lot during the course of the programme, but I said earlier on, Sonia, that schools' budgets, you talk to people around the country, they raise it again and again and again. Schools in a real problem, and the NHS has got the headlines, rough sleepers have got the headlines, but schools have been slightly pushed out recently.
Yeah, and that's why I picked this story. I think, it's a great reminder when we're talking about high politics and Brexit that actually there is a very grim reality out there in the country, whether it is the NHS or rough sleepers or schools. And we've had the Christmas break for schools, so things have gone slightly silent on the school funding front. But now the Observer splash is top academy chains raising the alarm bells, saying that the government is not funding schools sufficiently. We know that the Institute for Fiscal Studies has pointed out that real per pupil spending is going down over the next few years. Deepest cuts to school funding since the early 1980s. We've had head teachers write to the Prime Minister, head teachers write to parents and saying, we can't even afford things like toilet roll. You need to chip in here. And I think this is, I think this story has very potentially significant political ramifications for the Prime Minister. So there are lots of Conservative backbenchers in marginal constituencies with schools that are going to be affected by these cuts. So I think it's going to cause problems. I think the other very interesting angle of this story is that academies are the flagship education reform of this government. Now, this raises questions about what happens if some of the bigger chains go bust.
OK, let's move on. There's two other stories we absolutely must do. One is Donald Trump, and one is the Labour trans story, which I'll be talking about later on. Let's start with that one. So there is basically a culture war going on, Isabel.
Well, I think that segues quite nicely with Sonia's little party political broadcast there for the Labour Party. So absolutely agree with you, Sonia, that there are serious problems out there, schools, NHS, all the rest of it. What is Labour tying itself in knots over? It's a question of whether people who are transgender should be allowed to run on all-female shortlists. Now, I tried before coming on the programme to get some statistics about just how many people identify as transgender. Really difficult to get those stats, but I'm going to hazard a guess it's not in the millions or even in the tens of thousands. How many of those want to run for the Labour Party on an all-female shortlist? I'm going to hazard a guess it's probably less than on the fingers of these two hands.
And yet it is somehow the subject of the hour. I mean, if you go to I think it's the Marsden, one of these London clinics who talk to kids about wanting to change, who want to change their gender, the number of children wanting to do this is just shooting up at the moment. I don't know why.
I mean, there is a real thing here, and ITV have been running an extraordinarily moving documentary called Transformation Street, which I found myself watching, about people going through this process. And I don't think anyone who watched that programme could possibly suggest that anyone would elect to go through that traumatic surgery and all that hormonal treatment. But I do think that we need to keep a sense of proportion, and it is not the right thing for Labour to be obsessing about.
Philosophical question, Sam. But I don't want to talk any more about this because I want to talk about Trump only, and you've chosen Trump. So Piers Morgan, I'll be talking to shortly, got this interview with Trump, and he did get a real story out of that, which is Trump's quite hard-line position on Britain and Brexit, and also the EU, about which he's not a huge fan.
Donald Trump is trying to be, as it were, diplomatically helpful to Britain after being very undiplomatically helpful over much of the last year. But once again, he couldn't quite help himself. He was suggesting that Theresa May should have gone in harder on the Brexit debates. He says he might come up to 2 times this year, which again won't necessarily help her. Donald Trump is trying to do a little bit of an image overhaul. He's got his State of the Union address on Tuesday.
Is that the New York
Times? It's the Washington Post lead story today. And there is briefing ahead of that speech about how Donald Trump doesn't want to repeat the American carnage speech that he gave last year when he talked about the state of the US, but wants something much more low-key, which seizes on what he calls his economic successes, which economists, wonder whether or not he can really take the credit, which some economists wonder whether he can really take the credit for. But can we see a lower-key Donald Trump that just gets on with the job? I don't know, maybe Theresa May gave him some tips.
An extraordinary question to end on. A lower-key Donald Trump, very hard to get our heads around. Thank you all very much indeed for that. America first doesn't mean America alone. That was Donald Trump's most impressive soundbite at the Davos Forum, I thought. But he also found time to take possession of an Arsenal football shirt, don't ask, and to give his